Hi everybody, and welcome back to Language and Communication with me, Dr. Josh Redstone. Today I'm going to be finishing off our lectures for week 3. I know this is technically the start of week 4, but I am still kind of getting myself caught up. So we're going to finish the set of slides that I uploaded to See You Learn for week 3. I'm going to offer a little bit of a recap of slides 9 through 14, and then we'll proceed to discuss the rest of the material. The reason why I want to do it this way is because I feel like in my last lecture, I had actually intended that lecture to be a little shorter than it ended up being. I worry that I may have not explained things as clearly as I could have, thus the recap. I have also found a very interesting video series, very quick, very brief, that goes over the 4 logical puzzles that we talked about in our previous lecture. So while these videos don't go into the material in the same depth that we do in this class, they do a very good job of succinctly explaining why these logical puzzles are a problem for the referential theory of meaning, and also how thinkers like Frege and Russell addressed the problems. Now, the fact that they don't go into as much depth as we do in our lectures here might actually not be a bad thing, because Frege and Russell are both, while their writing is dry and difficult to get through, it can be kind of esoteric if you've not read either of these individuals before. And our textbook is also not an easy read. So I recommend that you all watch these videos. I'll put the playlist in the links in the video description. Put the links to the playlist in the video description, I should say. And I encourage you all to take a look if you're not feeling 100% comfortable with these ideas, or if you feel like you haven't quite got it yet, take a look at these and then go back to the slides, for example, or passages from the text and reread them. And I think that will make things a lot clearer if you're having a little difficulty with the material. Anyhow, that said, let's get on with our brief recap. Alright, so last time I talked about Chapter 1 and a bit of Chapter 2, and today I'd like to pick it up with Chapter 2 and recap some of the ideas there, particularly the 4 logical puzzles, which, again, if my explanation previously or if this explanation is not 100% clear, cross-reference with the video series that I recommend below, which deals with all of this, just the main kind of bullet points. In any case, we were talking about definite descriptions last time. So definite descriptions are a type of singular term. Lacan defines these as, quote, terms that purport to refer to single individuals, such as proper names, pronouns, and definite descriptions, unquote, or end quote. You can find that on page 9 of your textbook. So proper names are things like, you know, we said last time, there was a great example, Elizabeth Windsor, right? So Elizabeth II, i.e. Elizabeth Windsor, is a proper name. Josh Redstone is a proper name, right? All of your names are proper names. Pronouns are, of course, nouns that stand in for a proper name, like you, I, they, those kinds of things. Definite descriptions begin with the definite article the. So the Queen of England is a definite description, whereas Elizabeth Windsor is a proper name, whereas Her Majesty could function as a pronoun. So those are all singular terms, and what we're focusing particularly on here are definite descriptions. Now, if you remember, one of the problems with the referential theory of meaning is that definite descriptions can't get their meaning from what they denote. Because if they do, we see these logical puzzles start to emerge, the 4 puzzles we examined in brief last time. And that's what I want to go over again today. So firstly, the referential theory of meaning, if you recall, is the theory of meaning that I think we can trace back to John Stuart Mill. So we could call it a Millian understanding. At least this is how Mill understands proper names. But in any case, the idea behind the referential theory of meaning is that words get their meaning by picking out something in the world, right? By, that is, denoting something in the world, a person, an object. So the Queen of England, that definite description, denotes Elizabeth Windsor. Definite descriptions can't get their meaning that way. If they did, we would have a problem. We would have 4 problems, these logical puzzles that we saw last time. And they are the problem of apparent reference to non-existence, the problem of negative existentials, Frege's puzzle about identity, and finally, the problem of substitutivity. Now, I did take a look at these, but this is mainly where I'm concerned that my explanation may not have been as clear as I could have made it, mostly due to the fact that I kind of jumped back and forth in my discussion between the puzzles quite a bit. So apologize if you found that unclear. I will go through everything again one by one before we talk about Russell on proper names. So let's look at the first puzzle, and that is the problem of apparent reference to non-existence. So just in the notes that I have here, if a definite description is meaningful because it refers to something, or we could also put it this way, if a definite description is meaningful by virtue of that to which it refers, it's meaningful because it denotes a person or an object or something like the Queen of England or the cat on the mat or so forth, and there's no thing which it's actually able to denote, there's nothing that that description refers to, then there can't be any meaning. So this is why you see examples of non-existent things. Like one Russell uses a lot that we'll encounter as we move through this discussion is the King of France is bald, right? Well, that sentence shouldn't mean anything if the definite description, the King of France, doesn't denote any actual King of France, because there is no King of France, right? So that's meaningless. And yet, you can understand the King of France is bald. You can understand that sentence. So it seems to have meaning, and yet its meaning can't be coming from what it is denoting, because there's no King of France for that definite description to denote. That's the problem. So saying things like, here I have on the slides, Harry Potter thinks owls are neat, or perhaps Seymour Glass smiles enigmatically, are meaningless because they're about non-existent things. But they don't seem to be meaningless because we can still understand those sentences. So that's why this is a logical problem for the referential theory of meaning. All right, let's recap the next theory briefly. The problem of negative existentials. This is kind of related to the first problem. The problem of negative existentials has to do with the problem that if there is nothing to which a definite description can acquire its meaning from, then any expression that talks about, in a kind of affirmatory way, any expression that affirms the non-existence of the thing that we're talking about will also be meaningless. So a negative existential is, a sentence like, Pegasus never existed. If that sentence is true, if it has a positive truth value, then the sentence cannot be about Pegasus, because there is no Pegasus. Now, notice we're not dealing with a definite description here. We're dealing with a proper name, Pegasus, okay? So keep that in mind. Pegasus never existed. If true, the statement can't be about Pegasus, because there is no Pegasus for that proper name to denote, to refer to. If it is about Pegasus, which it seems to be, it can't be true. Again, there's no Pegasus. Now, Frege deals with this problem just by rejecting the idea that singular terms can be meaningful only through reference. Frege thinks that terms can be meaningful, singular terms can be meaningful because of their expression through a sense or a mode of presentation. And that's why words like Pegasus or sentences like Pegasus never existed or Odysseus was set ashore in Ithaca have meaning, even though there aren't any reference for those words or sentences. They're still meaningful by virtue of the fact that they have a sense. So that's how Frege addressed that problem. Frege also addresses a problem about identity, the puzzle of identity. So, if meaning is derived from reference, whether it's meaning of a word or of a whole sentences, then different terms that describe the same thing should mean precisely the same thing, right? This is kind of what Frege was saying in the beginning of his paper. If A equals B, if A equals A is true, if that identity statement is true, and it is also true that A and B are the same, then the statement A equals B is the same, truth value-wise, as the statement A equals A. But, here's the problem. So these identity statements, if it is true that A and B are the same, then the identity statements A equals A and A equals B, their meaning should be identical. So it should be trivial, right, what sign we use, what signs we use, whether it's A equals A or A equals B. But it's not trivial when we do this with proper names, right? So, for example, you could say something like, Luke Skywalker believes that Darth Vader is evil, right? Before he finds out who his real father is, at any rate. Luke Skywalker believes that Darth Vader is evil. But Luke Skywalker, at least prior to the lightsaber duel in The Empire Strikes Back, would not have agreed with the statement, Anakin Skywalker is evil, right? So, this is the problem of substitutivity. You can't change, I'm getting ahead of myself again. This is the problem with identity, right? These two different terms denote the same individual, so logically they're equivalent and it should be trivial, but it's not trivial. We seem to get some new information if we switch, if you're Luke Skywalker and you were to hear Anakin Skywalker is evil versus Darth Vader is evil, right? So that's the puzzle of identity. Of course, Frege addresses this, again, with the ideas of sense and reference. The problem of substitutivity is related to Frege's puzzle of identity. So, if, two terms like Darth Vader and Anakin Skywalker are semantically equivalent, we should be able to substitute them without changing the truth value of our sentence. And we can't do that, as I was just kind of mentioning before. I kind of got mixed up again. You can see I inadvertently jumped between the two different puzzles. But this is what the example of Superman and Clark Kent is supposed to illustrate, right? I mean, this is the textbook example of this kind of thing. Lois Lane believes that Clark Kent is a journalist at the Daily Planet is true. Lois Lane believes that Superman is a journalist at the Daily Planet is false, even though Superman and Clark Kent are both the same individual. So this is also known as referential opacity. So that is the recap that I wanted to offer of the four problems. Again, we've already kind of covered some of these. In particular, we've talked about the puzzle of identity and the problem of substitutivity. We talked about that a lot in the previous lecture when I went over Frege's paper. In any case, I cannot encourage you enough, if you're not sure about any of those aspects of these puzzles and how Frege solved them, or if you're uncertain about anything I'm going to talk about today with regard to how Russell tackles these problems with his theory of definite descriptions, do check out that video series. It boils it down very nicely, and after watching it, you can always go back to the course materials and shore up your knowledge of these four puzzles and how Frege and Russell have addressed them. All right, so that's it for my recap. I hope that wasn't too long. Now we're going to move on and talk about Bertrand Russell. So let's get to know Bertrand Russell a little bit, because he was an interesting figure. Like Frege, he was a mathematician as well as a philosopher, what we call a logician, somebody who works in the area of mathematics and logic. But beyond just mathematics, Russell also contributed to a variety of important areas. For example, he made very important contributions toward developing analytic philosophy. So the analytic or the Anglo-American tradition, Russell has a very powerful influence there. He also worked quite a bit in mathematical logic with Alfred North Whitehead, working to show that mathematics was actually grounded in logic, something that Russell did not think was entirely successful in an attempt to do. So Russell was also a social critic and a political activist. He even went to jail because of his activism. I'll share a little video of an interview with Russell following one of his stints in prison. And of course, Russell was heavily influenced by thinkers like Frege. Russell is also known not just because of his influence within analytic philosophy, but known because of some of his students, most notably Ludwig Wittgenstein, who we will look at later. Wittgenstein initially approached Frege when he got into studying philosophy, and Frege recommended that he study with Bertrand Russell, who initially thought that Wittgenstein was a crank, but later came to regard as a kind of genius. And even though Wittgenstein was Russell's student, Russell was in turn influenced by Wittgenstein, his student. And Russell influenced a number of other important thinkers in the field of linguistics too, including Noam Chomsky, who you've already looked at. So, where do we begin when it comes to Russell's work in language, or on language and on theories of meaning? Well, Russell points out this problem with ordinary language that he thinks arises when we analyze sentences or the meaning of sentences in terms of the sentence's grammatical form instead of their logical form. And we're going to explore the difference as we make our way through this lecture. What is this difference between grammatical form and logical form? What does Russell mean? We will come to understand that when we talk about how Russell understands definite descriptions. But what Russell thought was that grammar actually misleads those who are studying language and meaning, scholars and lay people alike, by the way, when it comes to understanding the meaning of linguistic expressions. So we're looking at the wrong thing. If we want to understand how language carries meaning, how semantics works, how do linguistic signs and symbols come to have the meanings that they do, whether we're talking about words or whole sentences, how do they have the meaning that we do? Most scholars, Russell argued, erroneously focused on the grammatical structure of sentences, whereas Russell thought what we need to be looking at is the logical the logical form of these sentences. The propositional content of a sentence, that is, what the sentence says and whether it is true or false, can only be discovered or recovered here, as it says in the slides, by analyzing the logical form of the sentence, not its grammatical form. And this is all on slide 16, by the way. So moving on to slide 17, let me try to elucidate this distinction between grammatical form and logical form a little bit. So we, in philosophy, use ordinary language, right? I'm not communicating this lecture to you in the predicate calculus. There's a little bit of predicate calculus in your textbook, but not much, thank goodness. because I'm much more comfortable, and I have no problem admitting this, I am much more comfortable using ordinary language to do this kind of work than logic. My facility with formal logic is not as good as I would like it to be, admittedly. But the downside of that is sometimes we're led into thinking that propositions are captured by just how the sentence is arranged, how the words in the sentence are arranged, and whether they are arranged in an acceptable form or a non-acceptable form, grammatically speaking. So we're focusing on the grammatical structure. We're using ordinary language when we do philosophy of language, typically. This is one area where I think Wittgenstein probably also would have been sympathetic, if not would have influenced Russell in this regard. In any case, I'm not going to speculate too much on that because I'm fuzzy on the details, but we mistakenly think that the content of the sentence, or the semantic content, what the sentence means, is captured by its grammatical form, not its logical form. Consider these two sets of sentences here on slide 17. First sentence, Jerry is happy. The second sentence, nobody is happy. Okay, so that's our first two. The second set, which we're going to compare the first two with, the squirrel was hit by the car, and the car hit the squirrel. Okay, so we've got two sentences, one in each set, and we're going to compare them. Let's jump over to slide 18 here and do that. So when we rely on grammatical structure to interpret meaning, what we're doing here is something like this. If I utter a sentence like, Jerry is happy, I seem to be saying something like referring to a person named Jerry, and I'm saying that he's happy. Versus nobody is happy. I'm not referring to a person named nobody. I'm saying that there exists no one who is happy. So nobody that exists is happy, right? The squirrel was hit by the car, and the car was hit by the squirrel, or the car hit the squirrel. Unlike the first set, these seem to mean the same thing. But the grammar in each case is different. But logically, they say the same thing. Grammatically speaking, the first set of sentences are nearly identical. It's a pronoun followed by is happy, right? So these are all propositional. In the first two, the sentences mean two very different things, and the grammar is pretty much the same. The second set of sentences mean very different things, or rather mean the second sentences mean pretty much the same thing, but the grammar is very different. So that illustrates the difference between the grammatical structure and the logical structure. And if you want to think of this in terms of Chomsky, you can think of it in terms of deep structure versus surface structure. I don't know the extent to which Will covered that, but I suspect this is one of those areas where Russell influenced Chomsky when he talks about transformational grammar and his whole idea between the deep structure of a sentence and the surface structure of the sentence, the form that a sentence takes versus its meaning. Okay, all right, now let's go to slide 18. Right, so on slide 18, we really get a sense of what Russell means by distinguishing between grammatical form and logical form. We saw this a bit on slide 17, where we had a pair of sentences that have a similar grammatical form but very different meaning, and another pair that has very similar meaning but very different grammatical form. But what about logical form? What Russell wants to do here when he's talking about logical form is to break down sentences with these predicative expressions into a logical form. So to quote from your textbook, page 9, a sentence containing a definite description, such as, the woman who lives there is a biochemist, has subject-predicate form only superficially, and is really, logically, a trio of generalizations. So what looks like a simple subject-predicate sentence is actually three logical propositions here. We can say that this is equivalent, picking up again, it is equivalent to at least one woman lives there, and at most one woman lives there, and whoever lives there is a biochemist. So a sentence like, the woman who lives there is a biochemist, is logically equivalent to three statements. At least one woman lives there, at most one woman lives there, and whoever lives there is a biochemist. This is the logical form. These three propositions are the logical form. It's what the sentence is actually saying, even though it's kind of disguised, Russell would say, as a predicative expression, a subject-predicate sentence. Okay? So, how does Russell get here? How does Russell go from saying, blah. So how does Russell get here anyway? I mean, he said we need to analyze things in terms of their logical form, not their grammatical form, those things being sentences. How does he get there? Well, it's because he's analyzing what the function of the word the is. As I mentioned earlier, the or the is a definite article. Now, he doesn't look at all functions of this word. He looks at some functions, but he wants to explain how it works through a sort of contextual definition rather than an explicit one. And that's why he examines these predicative sentences of the form, the F is G. The woman who lives there, F, is a biochemist, G. So that's a predicative expression. So let's go back to the idea of what names are. Names are singular terms. But what Russell thinks names are actually doing is working as these kinds of logical trios of definite descriptions kind of in disguise, right? So names are not words that pick out individuals. They're not names that refer to people, that denote people. What they are, logically, are actually definite descriptions. So, names are not expressing propositions like, whole sentences about the world that might be true or might be false. Names aren't doing that. What names are doing is actually denoting a particular individual, and they obtain their meaning from the thing that they denote. Thus, Russell says in his 1919 paper, quote, "So long as we are using names as names, whether we say Scott or whether we say Sir Walter is as irrelevant to what we are asserting as whether we speak English or French." End quote. So that bit that I just said, whether we use Sir Walter or we use Scott, this kind of answers some of the identity puzzles, right? Identity and substitutivity that Frege was kind of interested in as well. Russell offers a different answer. Where Frege relies on sense, Russell is saying, where Frege relies on sense as a mode of presentation, which is different than what a referent is. Russell's saying that names are really like abbreviated definite descriptions. Definite descriptions aren't used referentially. They're not used to refer. So names don't pick out people and refer to people. What they actually are these disguised trios of definite descriptions, like there is at least one woman who lives there, there's no more than one woman who lives there, and whoever lives there is a biochemist, right? So this actually leads Russell to deny that definite descriptions are singular terms. So names and definite descriptions are not singular terms, according to Russell, even though at the beginning of the lecture I reminded you that names and definite descriptions are singular terms. Russell would disagree with that. And the reason why he would disagree is because singular terms are referring, and that's not what definite descriptions do. Okay? So, that's all I will say about Russell. Russell making his case for his theory of descriptions anyway. Now, I think it would be good to wrap things up by beginning on slide 21, if you're following along, and we're going to take a look at a couple of objections that Strawson and Donnellan offer against Russell. All right, so these two objections, one from Strawson and one from Donelin toward Russell, let's go over them briefly. You can find the description of each of these objections on slide 21, by the way, if you're following along, if you have your slides open, which you should. Better yet, you should be taking notes too. Anyway, all right, so let's go over these two objections. You can find these on slide number 21, by the way, if you're following along, and you should be following along with your slides. Better yet, you should even be taking notes on your printed slides or elsewhere, because notes will be very helpful for you, again. Anyway, Strawson objects to Russell because Russell believes that sentences have meaning and can be true or false by virtue of the fact that sentences express propositions. And propositions, logically speaking, are statements about the world that can be either true or false. So Russell thinks that that's how sentences acquire their meaning. Strawson disagrees. Strawson says that sentences don't get their meaning because they express propositions. Actually, sentences get their meaning because of how they are used. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. Donelin rejects to Russell as well as Strawson. So Donelin thinks both Russell and Strawson are a little off the mark here. Russell assumes that descriptions are, in fact, attributive. But Strawson assumes that descriptions are referential, and I'll talk a little bit about the difference between the two in a minute. But Donelin says they're both kind of off the mark here. Descriptions are used in both ways. Descriptions can be used in the attributive sense, and they can also be used in the referential sense. So we'll take a look at that. What does that mean, referential versus attributive, in the slides to come. So let's look at Strawson's objection to Russell's theory. So remember, Russell thinks that sentences express propositions, and we're talking about logical propositions, the kind of thing that we could express with well-formed statements in the predicate calculus. You know, if you're not too familiar with predicate calculus, it's just it's a logical language that allows us to express things propositionally and to transform statements into other statements while making sure that we respect the rules of logic or the rules of proper reasoning. The little backwards letter E's and X's and Y's and stuff that looks like something you might find in a math or physics textbook in our textbook for this course, that is predicate calculus. So a proposition is the kind of thing we could express with that, and they need to be about the world, and they can be true or false. Those are the truth values they can take, true or false. Strawson has a very different view than Russell when it comes to this stuff, though. He disagrees with Russell about what linguistic expressions are and what they're supposed to do for us. So Strawson sees referring as an action, something speakers do with the language they use. So if I refer to something, that's something that I do, not some abstract relation between the logical form of the sentence that I've uttered and the thing that I'm referring to. You see what I mean? So on that view, on Strawson's view, sentences by themselves at any rate can't be true or false. So I guess Strawson would say that sentences don't express propositions. I think he would agree that propositions can be true or false. They're just not the kinds of things that sentences express. Sentences, and indeed language as a whole, is a bit like a tool that speakers use. It's not, again, some relation between the logical forms of the sentences we utter and the objects or entities in the world that those propositions refer to, okay? So if we take a statement like, the King of France is bald, or the King of Canada is wealthy, well, Russell would say that they are wrong, because they don't refer to anything. But Strawson would say they are not really wrong, they're just incomplete. They're not false, I should say. They're not logically false, they're just incomplete. If I say something like, the King of Canada is wealthy, what I've done as a speaker is just failed to refer properly. What makes a sentence true or false, according to Strawson? Well, it's actually... it actually has to do with how they're used. If they're used successfully and we can understand one another, then the sentence becomes true. If it becomes false if we can't use it successfully. A bit like the difference between Chomsky and Donald Davidson, right? Davidson denies or is... argues against the conventionalist view of language, right? And he says that, well, linguistic communication is something that happens not because we rely on these prior theories, but because when we come together and communicate, we each develop a passing theory, and if our theories converge, communication is successful. Strawson's saying something that's a little bit like that. In any case, what we can say for certain about Strawson is that sentences are true or false by virtue of the fact, by virtue of whether they are used successfully or unsuccessfully by the speakers that are using them. Not because they actually express propositions that refer to things and those propositions can be true or false. So it's a very different view of language than the Russellian view, we could call it. Let's move on to the next objection now. Donnellan thinks that Russell neglects referential use, while Strawson neglects attributive use, of definite descriptions, by the way. So let's consider, for example, a sentence which uses Smith's murderer as a definite description. So I'm using Smith's murderer as a definite description, which in the Russellian sense would mean something like... So let's say I use Smith's murderer in a sentence, Smith's murderer is insane. There's two different ways that I can actually do that. There's an attributive way or a referential way. If I do it in an attributive way, then what I'm doing is saying that whoever Smith's murderer is, she's insane. So I might use it in the sense that, say Smith is my neighbor, and I wake up and I find out that he's been murdered and the police are there, and perhaps I see the body on the way out and it's just brutally mutilated and it seems like such a horribly random crime. I don't know who Smith's murderer is, but I say something like, Smith's murderer is insane. If I'm doing that, I'm not referring to Smith's murderer, right? I'm not denoting a person who murdered Smith and calling them insane. I am simply saying, whoever Smith's murderer is, that person is insane. But I'm not referring to a particular individual. That's the attributive use. The referential use is a bit different. The referential use would be something like, say I'm called as a witness. Maybe I heard some noises coming from Smith's house the night before, so I'm a witness in the trial now. And my lawyer, the lawyer's asking me questions, and I point to the person who allegedly murdered Smith, and I say, Smith's murderer is insane. Well, what I'm there doing is referring to Smith's murderer. So I'm saying, there's Smith's murderer over there. I'm referring to her. Perhaps because she's drooling or babbling inconsistently or, seemingly plotting another crime, sneakily and suspiciously, twiddling her fingers like this. So I could say that Smith's murderer over there is insane, right? That's the referential use. Now, now Donnellan thinks that a problem with Russell's theory of descriptions is that it ignores referential use. And it assumes that all descriptions are used attributively. But he thinks that Strawson has the opposite problem. So he thinks that Strawson is Strawson is neglecting attributive uses of definite descriptions. So that's a kind of summary of the Donnellan objection and the two types of uses, attributive and referential, that he thinks that Strawson and Russell are both incorrect about. But there's more to this criticism, which we can take a look at here on slide 24. So Donnellan argues that this distinction between the attributive use and the referential use can render seemingly incorrect uses of definite descriptions correct. So the example here, which I believe is also drawn from the textbook, is if you ask about, say, the interesting looking man at a party who's drinking a martini. Now, he's a James Bond looking fellow, perhaps drinking a clear liquid from a martini glass. So you assume he's actually drinking a martini, and you refer to him, say as that interesting man over there who, is drinking a martini. Maybe he's like the most interesting man in the world maybe he's like the most interesting man in the world, only instead of a Dos Equis, he's drinking a martini. Or is he? Because it turns out the interesting man in the martini is just drinking water. Now, if I refer to him successfully, by saying that interesting man over there with the martini, even though what I say is wrong, he's not drinking a martini, he's just drinking water in a martini glass, Donnellan says that I've used that definite description, the interesting looking man drinking the martini, I've used it successfully because I've successfully used it in the referential sense to refer to somebody. Of course, this is also context bound, right? Perhaps it depends whether there's some other interesting man at the party with a martini. Perhaps I'm also gesturing at this interesting person who I believe is drinking a martini, but who is actually drinking water from a martini glass, so on and so forth. Now, Saul Kripke differs a little bit from Donnellan here. He says that some failed referential uses might be near misses. So here I have actually misspoken. Yes, I've referred to a man who seems to be drinking a martini, but he is not drinking. He's not drinking a martini at all. He's drinking water. But my intentions are understood because my description of this person is close enough to what everyone else is seeing and speaking about and everything in that situation. This has a lot to do with the idea that Kripke has of distinguishing between what the linguistic expression itself means and what the speaker means when she uses it, right? So the linguistic expression in this man with a martini example means that the linguistic expression here, the man drinking the martini, is false. But so the linguistic expression means, the interesting man drinking the martini is supposed to mean, by virtue of referring to this interesting man drinking a martini. So it's false. The linguistic expression there is wrong. I'm not using language right. But what I mean is that guy over there who's interesting looking and who is ostensibly, at any rate, drinking a martini. So communications might succeed if other communicators understand what I'm trying to communicate. So that's why Kripke calls these near misses. Now for Kripke, Donnellan hasn't shown that, quote, a sentence containing a definite description can be true even if nothing or something extraneous is the description semantic referent. And that's on page 29 of the textbook. But this really doesn't matter because communication has succeeded. So this is an idea, this is kind of like the semantic reference versus speaker reference, right? We could call it that. We could carve this up along the lines of semantic reference versus speaker reference. What the sentence I'm using means versus what I, as a speaker, mean when I use that sentence. So I can mean a true thing by saying something false, like the man with the martini. I can refer to an individual as the man with the martini, even though he's not a man drinking a martini. I can refer to Smith's murderer in various ways too. All right, so that's all I'm going to say about these objections for now. I think this lecture will come in at a little shorter than the last one. I hope it's clearer than the last one. Just in case, I'm going to go over the last slide, which contains some terminology, which will be helpful if you decide to review some of the reading materials, for example, after having watched this lecture. So we've been talking in this lecture and in the previous lecture about singular terms. So these include names, proper names, pronouns, and definite descriptions. Definite descriptions are the sorts of things that begin with the word the. The cat on the mat, for example, is a definite description. We've talked about the problem of negative existentials, which is, those are statements like Pegasus never existed. I'm saying a non-existent thing never existed. And we talked a little bit about the puzzle associated with that. We've distinguished between referential use, referring to somebody, versus attributive use, attributing characteristics to them, like saying Smith's murderer over there is insane, versus saying Smith's murderer, whoever he is, must be insane because look at this mess, or so on and so forth. We've talked about referential opacity, and we haven't really talked about referential transparency, but statements like Lois Lane believes that Clark Kent is a journalist at the Daily Planet, when compared with Lois Lane believes that Superman is a journalist at the Daily Planet. There's an opacity there, right? Even though these sentences refer to the same individual. And we've talked a little bit about contextual definition and explicit definition, although not much. So that's something I may say a few more words about in the following lecture. All right, so that's it for today. So that's all of the week 3 stuff. Your next quiz, quiz number 2, will cover the material from week 3. So it will cover readings, slides, these video lectures. I recommend you primarily refer to the slides and my lectures, and then you go back and use what I've discussed in these lectures and what appears on the slides. Go ahead and find those bits in the textbook and reread those if you're not certain about anything. Also, don't forget to refer to that handy-dandy playlist about the 4 logical puzzles and Frege and Russell's respective responses to the puzzles, or solutions to the puzzles, which again, I will link down here. Next up, I have a very brief video where I will go over the correct answers for quiz number 1, so that you can use that as a kind of study tool if you like. Until then, take care everybody, and I'll see you next time.